Sarah died in the street, sir. In the street. I didn't even have a chance to tell my daughter that I loved her that night. This girl knew what she was going to do to my daughter.
And, she said that she wished I would stab her.
Who said that?
Janet.
Said, I wish you'd stab me?
Yeah, she said, I bet you won't stab me, I wish you would. And, when Sarah was hitting me, I went to hit her, and I really did not mean stab her. Right. I'm not going to kill somebody.
I'm going to stab you and your Mexican boyfriend. Those chilling words were left on Sarah Ludeman's voicemail, a threat from Rachel Wade that would set the stage for a fateful night. Sarah, a bright and determined young woman, decided she wouldn't be intimidated any longer. She drove to confront Rachel, unaware of the simmering rage and jealousy that awaited her. But what Sarah didn't know was that Rachel wasn't just angry, she was prepared. A knife in hand, her mind set, the stage was set for a confrontation that would leave only one question. How far can jealousy push someone? What happened that night? The answers lie in the tragic events that followed. Sarah Ludeman was the cherished only child of Gay and Charles Ludeman, born on December 7, 1990, in Pinellas Park, Florida. Her upbringing was filled with love and support, with her parents placing high hopes on her bright future. Sarah was a model student, consistently earning straight A's and aspiring to become a veterinarian, a career choice that reflected her deep love for animals and her compassionate nature. Her academic achievements were a source of immense pride for her parents, who had long desired a child. Sarah's life was characterized by a strong sense of responsibility and a focus on her studies, making her a standout among her peers. Unlike many teenagers, Sarah wasn't interested in the typical high school dating scene. She was content with focusing on her goals, maintaining close friendships, and nurturing her dream of caring for animals. However, everything changed when she met Joshua Camacho, a young man with a magnetic personality and a job at the local Chick-fil-A. Joshua, with his charming demeanor and confident air, quickly captivated Sarah's attention. Their relationship began as an innocent connection, but soon developed into what Sarah believed to be a profound and serious romance. Joshua's attention was intoxicating for Sarah, who until then had not experienced such intense emotions. Yet Joshua was far from the ideal partner Sarah imagined. Beneath his charm lay a complex and manipulative individual who was juggling relationships with multiple women. Unknown to Sarah, Joshua was also romantically involved with Rachel Wade, a young woman whose life had taken a much different trajectory. Rachel Wade's background starkly contrasted with Sarah's. Born into a less stable environment, Rachel had dropped out of high school at just 16, a decision that set her on a tumultuous path. She quickly moved out of her parents' home, supporting herself by working as a waitress at Applebee's and renting her own apartment. Independent yet troubled, Rachel was known for her flirtatious behavior, a reputation that followed her from high school. Despite dating various boys, she became deeply infatuated with Joshua, viewing him as the one stable element in her otherwise chaotic life. This infatuation turned obsessive, and as Joshua continued to play both women against each other, Rachel's fixation on him grew. The situation quickly devolved into a toxic love triangle, with Rachel and Sarah finding themselves in a bitter rivalry. The tension between them was palpable and only worsened as they both vied for Joshua's attention. What began as verbal harassment soon escalated. Rachel and Sarah exchanged threatening voicemails, filled with vitriol and resentment. Their confrontations became increasingly public and hostile. Sarah, who was once focused on her future, was now consumed by this rivalry. She and her friends would go out of their way to antagonize Rachel, following her, intentionally bumping into her car, and even engaging in juvenile pranks like spraying her with silly string. Rachel, in turn, retaliated with her own threats, often warning Sarah to stay away from Joshua, who seemed to relish the attention and drama that surrounded him. Despite the hostile atmosphere, Sarah remained blinded by her feelings for Joshua. She was convinced that he was worth fighting for, despite the growing animosity and the increasingly dangerous situation. The emotional turmoil, fueled by jealousy and competition, continued to escalate, with neither woman willing to back down. As the months passed, the rivalry between Sarah Ludeman and Rachel Wade only intensified. The confrontations became more frequent and more heated, each one bringing them closer to the inevitable tragedy that would unfold. By April 2009, the rivalry had reached a critical point. The once verbal threats had become more menacing, and the simmering hostility was ready to explode. On April 14th, Rachel Wade learned that Joshua was spending time with Sarah. Consumed by anger and frustration, Rachel made a fateful phone call to Sarah, delivering a chilling threat. "I'm going to stab you and your Mexican boyfriend." This statement would later become a focal point in the legal proceedings, underscoring the premeditated nature of the violence that was about to occur. That night, Sarah was at Joshua's house when she received yet another threatening call from Rachel. This time, Sarah's response was different, perhaps driven by a mixture of fear, anger, and exhaustion from the ongoing harassment. Sarah decided she would no longer be passive. She chose to confront Rachel head-on. Sarah got into her parents' minivan and drove to Rachel's apartment, her mind likely racing with a mix of emotions, determination, defiance, perhaps even a hope that this confrontation might finally bring an end to the hostility. Rachel, on the other hand, had already steeled herself for the encounter. Anticipating that Sarah might come to confront her, she armed herself with a razor-sharp steak knife. This simple kitchen tool, in Rachel's hands, would soon become a deadly weapon. As Sarah arrived at Rachel's apartment, the atmosphere was thick with tension. Both young women were on edge, driven by a mixture of fear, anger, and a misguided sense of resolve. The confrontation that ensued was brief but catastrophic. As Sarah approached in her minivan, Rachel, armed with the knife, was ready to strike. In a matter of moments, the situation spiraled out of control. Rachel attacked, stabbing Sarah twice, once in the shoulder and once in the chest. The latter blow punctured Sarah's heart, a wound so forceful that the knife itself was bent out of shape. The violent encounter was witnessed by several bystanders, who immediately called 911. Sarah was quickly rushed to the hospital, but the injuries she sustained were too severe. Despite the efforts of medical personnel, Sarah Ludeman was pronounced dead in the early hours of April 15, 2009. The life of a bright and promising young woman was abruptly ended, and the consequences of that night would reverberate through the lives of everyone involved. In the hours following the tragic confrontation, Rachel Wade was quickly apprehended by the police. The gravity of the situation hit Rachel hard when she learned that Sarah Ludeman had died from the stabbing. As she broke down, investigators began to piece together the events that led to the tragic incident. Witnesses, including Joshua Camacho, identified Rachel as the attacker, corroborating their accounts with the menacing voicemail she had left for Sarah. These messages, filled with threats, became pivotal evidence as the case unfolded. Rachel Wade was soon charged with second-degree murder, a serious accusation that would place her at the center of a highly publicized trial. Her defense hinged on a claim of self-defense, arguing that Sarah had aggressively approached her with the minivan, leaving Rachel no choice but to protect herself. However, the prosecution painted a different picture, one where Rachel's actions were not spontaneous but premeditated. The voicemails she left were presented as proof of her intent to cause harm. The trial was closely followed by the media, becoming a symbol of how intense emotions and rivalries can lead to catastrophic outcomes. Emotional testimonies from friends and family provided a window into the destructive nature of the love triangle that had entangled Rachel, Sarah, and Joshua. Joshua Camacho's testimony added another layer of complexity to the case. Despite earlier statements to the police about his relationships with both women, he denied being romantically involved with either during the trial, contradicting himself and leaving an air of uncertainty around his role in the tragic events. In September 2010, after deliberating on the evidence, the jury found Rachel Wade guilty of second-degree murder. The judge sentenced her to 27 years in prison, a punishment that reflected the severity of the crime and the irreversible loss of Sarah Ludeman's life. Rachel was incarcerated at the Florida Women's Reception Center in Ocala, where she remains to this day. Her earliest possible release date, a distant hope for freedom, is set for September 29, 2032. The Rachel Wade and Sarah Ludeman case continues to resonate as a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked jealousy and emotional turmoil. The incident is often cited in discussions around teen violence, highlighting how volatile emotions, when left unchecked, can escalate into tragic outcomes. Years after the trial, those connected to the case still reflect on the profound loss. Sarah Ludeman's life was abruptly ended, while Rachel Wade's life was irrevocably altered by her actions, resulting in a lengthy prison sentence. Rachel has reportedly expressed regret for the incident, but the weight of her sentence and the loss of 2 young lives continues to resonate. In prison, Rachel's story is used as a cautionary example in educational settings, highlighting the importance of responsible decision-making during adolescence. The narrative underscores the destructive power of jealousy and how it can spiral into violence if left unchecked. Joshua Camacho, the individual at the center of the feud, chose to remove himself from the public eye after the trial. He moved out of state, seeking to escape the intense media scrutiny that followed the case. Since then, he has lived a quiet life, distancing himself from the tragic events that unfolded. For the Ludeman family, the loss of Sarah was devastating. As their only daughter, Sarah's death left an irreplaceable void in their lives. The bright and ambitious young woman who had dreamed of becoming a veterinarian was remembered by her family and community as someone full of potential. Her death prompted reflection within the Pinellas Park community, with many questioning how such a situation could have escalated to such a deadly conclusion. So what are your thoughts on this case? Could this tragedy have been prevented, or was it an inevitable result of unchecked emotions spiraling out of control? How do you think the involvement of social pressures and Joshua Camacho's role contributed to this devastating outcome? We'd love to hear your opinions. Share them in the comments below. With that being said, let us move to the next case.
Lassie Peterson was a vibrant 27-year-old woman who lived in Modesto, California with her husband, Scott Peterson. They appeared to have an idyllic life, living in a quaint 3-bedroom bungalow in an upscale neighborhood near East La Loma Park. Lacey, who was 8 months pregnant, was eagerly anticipating the birth of their first child, a boy they had decided to name Connor. She was a beloved member of her community, known for her warmth, charm, and devotion to family and friends. Lacey and Scott had met at California Polytechnic State University, where Scott studied agricultural business and Lacey pursued ornamental horticulture. They dated for 2 years before marrying in 1997 at the Sycamore Mineral Springs Resort. After their wedding, they moved to San Luis Obispo, where they opened a sports bar called The Shack. Their entrepreneurial venture was initially successful, but they eventually sold the bar in April 2001 to move to Modesto and start a family. In Modesto, Lassie embraced her role as a homemaker, enjoying activities like cooking, entertaining, and gardening. She took a part-time job as a substitute teacher while Scott worked for Trade Corp USA, a fertilizer company, earning $5,000 a month. The couple's home was always immaculate, reflecting Lassie's meticulous nature and passion for creating a welcoming environment. She was deeply involved in preparing for the arrival of their son, having already decorated the nursery and frequently indulging in baby-related shopping sprees. Scott Peterson, meanwhile, projected the image of a dedicated husband and soon-to-be father. However, beneath this veneer lay a series of troubling behaviors and secrets. Scott had a history of extramarital affairs, the most recent being with Amber Frey, a massage therapist from Fresno. Amber, who was unaware that Scott was married, would later be a key figure in the investigation. On the evening of December 23, 2002, Lacey and Scott visited Salon, where Lacey's sister Amy Rocha worked. Amy cut Scott's hair, a monthly routine. During this visit, Scott mentioned that he would pick up a fruit basket for Amy the next day because he would be playing golf near the retailer. This detail would later become significant, as it was part of Scott's alibi for the day Lacey disappeared. The following day, Christmas Eve, Scott claimed he left home around 9:30 a.m., heading to the Berkeley Marina to go fishing. He told investigators that Lacey was watching a Martha Stewart show about marrying and preparing to mop the floor, bake cookies, and walk the family dog, Mackenzie. Scott's version of events included leaving a voicemail for Lacey around 2:15 p.m., stating, "Hey, beautiful, it's 2:15. I'm leaving Berkeley." Around 10:30 a.m. on December 24th, Karen Service, a neighbor, found Mackenzie wandering the neighborhood with a muddy leash. She returned the dog to the Petersons' backyard. Later, another neighbor, Mike Chiavetta, also saw Mackenzie outside around 10:45 a.m. By the early afternoon, Scott returned home to find Lacey's car in the driveway, but the house empty. He showered and washed his clothes, explaining that he had gotten wet while fishing. When Lacey failed to return home, Scott called her mother, Sharon Rocha, to see if Lacey was with her. Upon learning Lacey was missing, Sharon and Lacey's stepfather, Ron Gransky, contacted the Modesto Police Department, and detectives Alan Brocchini and John Buehler were assigned to the case. They arrived at the Peterson home on the evening of December 24, 2002. Inside the house, they found Lassie's keys, wallet, and sunglasses on the counter, her purse in a closet, and a phone book open to a full-page ad for a defense lawyer. These items indicated that Lacey had not left the house voluntarily. Scott's behavior during these initial interactions with the police raised suspicions. He was reportedly calm and cooperative, but his demeanor struck the detectives as unusual for a man whose pregnant wife was missing. He told the detectives that he had last seen Lacey around 9:30 a.m. when he left for a solo fishing trip at the Berkeley Marina. Scott's story about his activities that day included detailed descriptions of the fishing trip and his interactions with people he encountered at the marina, but his alibi was soon scrutinized. At the time of her disappearance, Lacey was 7.5 months pregnant, and the story quickly attracted national media attention. The initial hours and days of the investigation were crucial as authorities began to piece together the timeline and circumstances surrounding Lassie's last known activities. The Modesto Police Department quickly mobilized search efforts. Volunteers and law enforcement officers canvassed the neighborhood, distributing flyers with Lassie's picture and searching nearby parks and waterways. Search dogs were brought in, and helicopters equipped with infrared sensors scanned the area. The community rallied, with hundreds of volunteers assisting in the search. The police set up a command center to coordinate the extensive search efforts, which were covered extensively by local and national media. As the search continued, investigators focused on Scott's alibi and behavior. They learned that Scott had purchased a boat on December 9th, just weeks before Lassie disappeared, but had not mentioned this to anyone. He had taken the boat out for a test run on December 20th, a fact he had also kept to himself. Investigators found it odd that Scott, an avid golfer, would choose to go fishing alone on Christmas Eve, a day typically spent with family. In the days following Lacey's disappearance, Scott's inconsistencies became more apparent. He initially told people he had been golfing on Christmas Eve, only to later change his story to fishing. Scott's interactions with the media also drew attention. During a candlelight vigil for Lassie, he was spotted laughing and joking, behavior considered inappropriate given the circumstances. Moreover, Scott sold Lacey's car and inquired about selling their home just days after she went missing, actions that seemed premature and callous. As the investigation progressed, police discovered Scott's extramarital affair with Amber Frey, a massage therapist from Fresno. Amber had met Scott on November 20th, 2002, through a mutual friend. Scott had told her he was single and had lost his wife. On December 30th, 2002, Amber contacted the Modesto Police Department after learning about Lassie's disappearance and Scott's deceit. She agreed to cooperate with the investigation and allowed the police to record their phone conversations. The recordings provided critical evidence. In these conversations, Scott continued to lie to Amber about his marital status, even after Lacey was reported missing. He did not disclose that his wife was missing and expressed no concern over the situation. Instead, Scott maintained a romantic and carefree demeanor, further implicating himself in the eyes of investigators and the public. As weeks turned into months, the search for Lacey Peterson continued with no significant breakthroughs. The media's intense focus on the case kept it in the public eye, and suspicions about Scott Peterson's involvement grew stronger. The police meticulously pieced together the timeline of Lassie's last known movements and Scott's activities on the day of her disappearance, but they lacked the concrete evidence needed to make an arrest. In April 2003, nearly 4 months after Lassie's disappearance, a gruesome discovery was made that would change the course of the investigation. On April 13th, a couple walking their dog along the San Francisco Bay shore near the Berkeley Marina found the decomposed body of a late-term male fetus. The next day, the body of a recently pregnant woman was found washed ashore about a mile away. The remains were badly decomposed, but it was clear that the woman had been pregnant, and the fetus had been expelled from her body after death, likely due to the natural processes that occur after a pregnant woman dies. DNA testing confirmed what many had feared. The bodies were those of Laci Peterson and her unborn son Connor. The location of their discovery was chillingly close to where Scott had claimed to be fishing on December 24, 2002. This revelation cast an even darker shadow over Scott Peterson, who had been under intense scrutiny from both the media and law enforcement since Lassie's disappearance. The discovery of the bodies provided the physical evidence needed to arrest Scott Peterson. On April 18, 2003, Scott was apprehended near a La Jolla golf course. At the time of his arrest, Scott had dyed his hair blonde, grown a goatee, and had with him nearly $15,000 in cash, several credit cards belonging to his family members, and multiple cell phones. These items suggested to investigators that Scott was preparing to flee, further implicating him in the eyes of the public and the authorities. Scott Peterson was charged with 2 felony counts of murder on April 21, 2003, for the deaths of Lassie and Connor. The charges specified that Scott faced first degree for taking Laci's life and second degree for the death of Connor. The decision to charge Scott with Connor's death as a separate count was made possible by California's fetal homicide law, which allows for the prosecution of individuals who'd unalive a fetus that has reached a certain stage of development. The prosecution's case against Scott Peterson hinged on several key pieces of evidence. First, there was the timeline of Scott's activities on the day Laci disappeared, which included the suspicious circumstances of his fishing trip. Investigators believed that Scott had used his newly purchased boat to dispose of Laci's body in the bay. Second, there was the affair with Amber Frey, which provided a motive for the crime. Amber's recorded conversations with Scott were particularly damning, as they revealed his deceit and lack of concern for his missing wife. The trial of Scott Peterson began on June 1, 2004, in Redwood City, California. Due to the extensive media coverage and public interest in the case, it was decided that the trial would be moved from Modesto to ensure a fair trial. The trial was presided over by Judge Alfred DeLucci, and the lead prosecutor was Rick DiStasso, while Scott's defense was handled by high-profile attorney Mark Geragos. During the trial, the prosecution presented a compelling narrative that Scott had killed Laci to escape the constraints of marriage and impending fatherhood. They argued that Scott wanted to be free to continue his affair with Amber Frey and pursue other romantic interests. The prosecution introduced evidence of Scott's deceit, his purchase of the boat, and the suspicious timing of his activities on the day Laci disappeared. They also highlighted Scott's behavior in the days and weeks following Laci's disappearance, including his attempts to sell their house and his apparent lack of concern for Laci's well-being. The defense, on the other hand, argued that the evidence against Scott was purely circumstantial. They suggested that Laci could have been abducted and murdered by someone else, pointing to reports of suspicious individuals in the neighborhood on the day she disappeared. The defense also challenged the prosecution's timeline and questioned the credibility of some of the witnesses. They argued that the lack of direct evidence linking Scott to the crime should result in his acquittal. Despite the defense's efforts, the jury found Scott Peterson guilty of first-degree murder for the death of Laci Peterson and second-degree murder for the death of Connor Peterson. The verdict was delivered on November 12, 2004. On March 16, 2005, Scott was sentenced to death by lethal injection and was sent to San Quentin State Prison to await execution. Amber Frey's cooperation with the police and her testimony had been instrumental in building the case against Scott Peterson. After the trial, Amber Frey wrote a book titled Witness for the prosecution of Scott Peterson, in which she detailed her relationship with Scott and her experiences during the investigation and trial. The book provided further insights into her perspective and the emotional toll the case had on her. Amber also made several public appearances and interviews, discussing her role in the case and advocating for victims of deceit and domestic violence. The public's reaction to the case's conclusion was deeply divided. On one hand, many people were convinced of his guilt, swayed by the circumstantial evidence and Scott's suspicious behavior. On the other hand, some members of the public and certain commentators believed that Scott Peterson might be innocent or that he had not received a fair trial. They argued that the evidence against him was circumstantial and that the media frenzy had biased public opinion and potentially the jury. The high-profile nature of the case also sparked discussions about the role of the media in the justice system, particularly regarding the presumption of innocence until proven guilty. After Scott Peterson's conviction and sentencing, the case continued to make headlines. In 2020, his death sentence was overturned by the California Supreme Court due to juror misconduct during the penalty phase of the trial. The court ruled that the trial judge had improperly dismissed prospective jurors who expressed opposition to the death penalty but indicated they could follow the law and impose it if necessary. This decision led to a new penalty phase trial being ordered, although Scott's conviction for the murders of Lassie and Connor was upheld. In recent years, the Los Angeles Innocence Project has taken up Scott Peterson's case, arguing that there is new evidence that could exonerate him. The Innocence Project claims that Scott's state and federal constitutional rights were violated and that critical evidence from the original trial was mishandled or overlooked. They have filed motions seeking access to this evidence, and their involvement has reignited public interest and debate about Scott's guilt and the integrity of the original investigation and trial. One of the key arguments presented by the Innocence Project involves allegations of juror misconduct during the original trial. They argue that one of the jurors, known as Strawberry Shortcake due to her red hair, failed to disclose her own history of domestic violence, which could have influenced her judgment. This juror's omission, they claim, violated Scott's right to an impartial jury, a cornerstone of the judicial process. In parallel, Scott's family has remained vocal in their support, consistently arguing that he was wrongfully convicted. They have maintained a public presence, advocating for his release and emphasizing what they perceive as flaws in the investigation and trial. The Peterson family's efforts have been crucial in keeping the case in the public eye and attracting support from legal organizations and individuals who believe in Scott's innocence. The Scott Peterson case has had far-reaching implications beyond the immediate legal battles. It has prompted discussions about the death penalty, the reliability of circumstantial evidence, and the potential for wrongful convictions. Legal experts and commentators have used the case to highlight the importance of rigorous forensic analysis, the need for impartial juries, and the ethical responsibilities of media coverage in high-profile cases. Furthermore, the case has influenced legal practices and reforms. The extensive media coverage and public interest have led to calls for stricter guidelines on how such cases are reported, aiming to prevent undue influence on public opinion and the judicial process. There have also been discussions about juror screening processes to ensure that individuals with potential biases are identified and excluded from serving on juries. As Scott Peterson's legal team continues to fight for a new trial or exoneration, the case remains a focal point for debates about justice, fairness, and the complexities of the American legal system. The ongoing developments ensure that the legacy of the Peterson case will endure, serving as both a cautionary tale and a catalyst for change in how criminal cases are investigated, prosecuted, and reported.
Do you think about me? Because I think about you all the time, Pamela said to Flynn. Pamela Smart was a 22-year-old media coordinator at Winnicott High School in Hampton, New Hampshire. In early 1990s, she began an illicit affair with 15-year-old student William Billy Flynn. Smart, who was also involved in producing media projects at the school, met Flynn through their mutual interest in the school's media program. The affair quickly escalated, driven by Smart's dissatisfaction with her marriage to Greg Smart, a 24-year-old insurance agent. Their affair began after Smart invited Flynn and another friend, Cecilia Pierce, over to her condo to watch the sexually explicit movie 912 Weeks. This film, known for its provocative scenes, set the stage for what would become an inappropriate and manipulative relationship between Smart and Flynn. Flynn later claimed that Smart initiated sex with him after sending Pierce to walk her dog, marking the start of their secret affair. Smart, a charismatic and assertive figure, used her maturity and position of authority to captivate Flynn, who was a naive and impressionable teenager. Over the following weeks, Smart and Flynn's relationship intensified. Smart showered Flynn with attention and affection, making him feel valued and significant. This attention was intoxicating for Flynn, who had never experienced such a relationship before. Smart allegedly began to manipulate Flynn emotionally, convincing him that they could only be together if her husband, Greg Smart, was out of the picture. She painted a dire picture of her marital situation, claiming that Greg was abusive and that a divorce was not a viable option due to financial constraints and societal pressures. Smart's manipulation of Flynn involved playing on his emotions and insecurities. She allegedly told Flynn that if he truly loved her, he would prove it by helping her remove Greg from their lives. This manipulation exploited Flynn's desire for love and acceptance, making him believe that committing this crime was an act of devotion. Smart's influence over Flynn was so strong that he began to accept the idea of taking a life as the only solution to their problem. To carry out the plan, Smart further manipulated Flynn by enlisting the help of his friends, Patrick Randall and Vance Latham Jr., both teenagers. She promised Flynn and his friends $500 each from the anticipated $140,000 life insurance payout she would receive from Greg Smart's policy. This promise of financial reward added an element of enticement to the already emotionally charged plot. The teenagers, under Smart's guidance, meticulously planned the act. They decided that the best time to carry it out would be when Greg came home from work, ensuring he would be caught off guard. Smart instructed them to stage the scene to look like a burglary gone wrong, which she believed would divert suspicion away from her. She allegedly provided details about the layout of the house and Greg's routines to aid them in their planning. On May 1st, 1990, the plan was put into action. Flynn, along with Patrick Randall and Vance Latham Jr., entered the Smart residence in Derry, New Hampshire. The teenagers were armed and mentally prepared for what they were about to do, driven by the manipulation and promises made by Smart. They had been instructed to make the crime appear as a burglary gone wrong to deflect any suspicion from Smart herself. As they waited inside the house, the atmosphere was tense, filled with a mix of adrenaline and fear. Flynn, who was both nervous and determined, had been convinced that this act was necessary for his future with Smart. When Greg Smart arrived home, he was taken by surprise. The ambush was swift and brutal. Flynn, following the plan, shot Greg in the head with a .38 caliber revolver, killing him instantly. The execution of the plan was cold and calculated, with Randall assisting by holding a knife to Greg's throat during the attack to ensure compliance. After the slaying, the teenagers ransacked the house to stage the scene as a botched burglary. They overturned furniture and scattered items around the room to make it look as though an intruder had been searching for valuables. This staging was meant to create a plausible scenario for the police, allowing the teenagers and Smart to avoid suspicion. However, the scene was not convincing enough to withstand scrutiny. Pamela Smart returned home later that evening to discover her husband's body and immediately called the police. Her demeanor during the call and subsequent interactions with the authorities raised suspicions. Investigators noted her composed and unemotional reaction, which they found inconsistent with someone who had just found their spouse deceased. This lack of visible distress, coupled with inconsistencies in her account of the events, led the police to question her version of the story. As the investigation progressed, The police initially considered the possibility of a burglary gone wrong, given the way the scene had been staged. However, as they delved deeper, the evidence began to point in a different direction. They discovered that the crime scene lacked typical signs of a struggle that would be expected in a home invasion. There were no signs of forced entry, which suggested that the perpetrator had access to the home, further raising doubts about the burglary narrative. Not long after the incident, the investigation took a significant turn when Cecilia Pierce, a 16-year-old student and intern at Winnicott High School's Media Center, came forward with crucial information. Pierce had been close to Pamela Smart and was aware of the affair with Billy Flynn. In conversations with Pierce, Smart had confided details about her relationship with Flynn and her frustrations with her marriage to Greg Smart. Pierce revealed to the authorities that Smart had openly discussed plans to eliminate her husband, a revelation that provided investigators with a direct link between Smart and the whole plot. Recognizing the potential of Pierce's testimony, the police asked her to cooperate further by wearing a wire to record conversations with Smart. Pierce agreed, and these recordings became instrumental in the investigation. Although the audio quality was poor, the recordings captured Smart making incriminating statements that indicated her involvement in the scheme. In one recorded conversation, Smart suggested that they would face severe consequences if the truth came out, indicating her awareness of the plot's criminal nature. These recordings, despite their technical limitations, were pivotal in building a case against Smart. Following the revelations from Pierce, the police intensified their investigation. Flynn, along with Patrick Randall and Vance Latham Jr., was brought in for questioning. Under intense interrogation, Flynn eventually confessed to the slaying, providing a detailed account of how Pamela Smart had orchestrated the entire plot. Flynn described the emotional manipulation he experienced at the hands of Smart, who had convinced him that killing Greg was the only way for them to be together. He recounted how Smart had planned the act, instructed him and his friends on how to execute it, and assured them of financial rewards. Randall and Latham corroborated Flynn's account, providing additional details about the planning and execution of the slaying. They testified that Smart had been the mastermind behind the plot, providing guidance and encouragement throughout the process. Their testimonies painted a picture of a calculated plan driven by Smart's desire to remove her husband from her life. Armed with these confessions and the evidence gathered from Pierce's recordings, the police arrested Pamela Smart on August 1, 1990, 3 months after the slaying. The arrest of Smart garnered significant media attention due to the sensational nature of the crime, involving a teacher-student affair and a sinister plot. The case became even more notorious as it was one of the first trials in the United States to be televised, allowing the public to follow the proceedings closely. Smart maintained her innocence, denying any involvement in the crime and claiming that she had been framed by the teenagers. However, the testimonies of Flynn, Randall, and Latham, along with other evidence gathered during the investigation, painted a compelling picture of her role in the crime. The trial of Pamela Smart began on March 4, 1991, at the Rockingham County Superior Court in Exeter, New Hampshire. It was one of the first high-profile cases in the United States to be televised gavel to gavel, capturing national attention with its mix of sensational elements. A young, attractive woman, a forbidden affair with a teenage student, and a brutal slaying. The prosecution, led by Assistant Attorney General Diane Nicolosi, argued that Pamela Smart was the mastermind behind the slaying of her husband, Greg Smart. They presented a narrative of manipulation and emotional coercion, where Smart used her relationship with Flynn to persuade him to take her husband's life. The prosecution's case was heavily based on the testimonies of Billy Flynn, Patrick Randall, and Vance Latham Jr., all of whom had entered plea deals in exchange for their cooperation. Flynn testified that Pamela Smart had seduced him, leveraging her allure and position of authority to manipulate him into believing that the only way they could be together was if Greg Smart was eliminated. Flynn described in detail how Smart had orchestrated the entire plot, providing specific instructions on how and when to carry out the slaying. He explained how Smart used emotional manipulation, convincing him that removing Greg was essential for their future together. Flynn recounted how Smart had instructed him to stage the crime scene to look like a burglary gone wrong, even down to specific details about how to make the crime look plausible. Patrick Randall and Vance Latham corroborated Flynn's testimony, adding their own accounts of the planning and execution of the crime. They described how Smart had been the driving force behind the plot, detailing the roles they were each assigned and how Smart had directed them throughout the planning process. Their testimonies painted a picture of a calculated plan masterminded by Smart, who had used her influence over Flynn and the other teenagers to achieve her goals. In addition to the testimonies, the prosecution presented physical evidence that linked Smart to the plot. This included phone records showing communication between Smart and the teenagers and notes that detailed aspects of the plan. The prosecution argued that Smart's motive was to escape an unhappy marriage and potentially benefit from Greg's $140,000 life insurance policy. They contended that this financial incentive, coupled with her desire to continue her relationship with Flynn, provided a compelling motive for her involvement in the crime. The defense, led by attorney Mark Sisti, maintained that Pamela Smart had no involvement in the crime and that she was being framed by the teenagers who were trying to mitigate their own culpability. Sisti argued that Flynn and his accomplices were the ones solely responsible for the crime and that Smart had been unaware of their plans. He emphasized the lack of direct physical evidence linking Smart to the crime scene and questioned the credibility of the teenagers' testimonies, suggesting that their plea deals provided them with strong incentives to lie. Smart herself took the stand, denying any involvement in the plot and asserting that her affair with Flynn had been a regrettable mistake but had nothing to do with her husband's death. She claimed that Flynn and the others had acted independently and were lying to protect themselves. Smart's defense highlighted the absence of any direct evidence placing her at the scene of the crime or directly linking her to the nefarious scheme, arguing that the prosecution's case relied too heavily on the statements of convicted felons. Throughout the trial, the defense sought to portray Smart as a scapegoat, a woman wrongfully accused in a high-profile case that had been heavily influenced by media coverage. They argued that the public's fascination with the case and the intense media scrutiny had created an atmosphere that was biased against her from the start. Despite these efforts, the jury ultimately found the testimonies and evidence presented by the prosecution more convincing. After 14 days of testimony and 18 hours of deliberation, the jury found Pamela Smart guilty on all counts: being an accomplice to first-degree slaying, conspiracy to taking a life, and witness tampering. The verdict was delivered on March 22, 1991, marking the end of a highly publicized trial that had captivated the nation. The courtroom atmosphere was tense as the jury's decision was announced, with Smart maintaining her composure despite the gravity of the situation. Smart was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The harsh sentence reflected the jury's belief in her central role in orchestrating the death of her husband, Greg Smart. This life sentence ensured that Smart would spend the rest of her life incarcerated, with no opportunity for parole or early release. In contrast, Flynn, Randall, and Latham received reduced sentences in exchange for their cooperation with the prosecution. Billy Flynn, who had confessed to shooting Greg Smart and testified against Pamela Smart, was sentenced to 28 years to life. His emotional testimony and cooperation with the authorities played a significant role in the case against Smart. Patrick Randall, who had held a knife to Greg Smart's throat during the act, received a sentence of 40 years to life. Vance Latham Jr., who had provided the getaway car and weapon used in the crime, was sentenced to 30 years to life. The plea deals offered to these teenagers were instrumental in securing their testimonies, which were critical to the prosecution's case. All three teenagers have since been released from prison. Flynn was granted parole in 2015, having served nearly 25 years behind bars. Randall and Latham were also released after serving their respective sentences. Their releases were contingent on their cooperation with the authorities and expressions of remorse during their parole hearings. The outcomes for Flynn, Randall, and Latham contrast sharply with Pamela Smart's continued incarceration, underscoring the severity with which the court viewed her role in orchestrating the slaying. Following her sentencing, Pamela Smart was initially incarcerated at the New Hampshire State Prison for Women before being transferred to Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for Women in New York, where she remains to this day. While in prison, Smart has worked to better herself and others around her. She has earned 2 master's degrees, one in literature and one in legal studies, from Mercy College, funded by private donations. Smart has also become an advocate for women's rights in prison, joining the National Organization for Women, NOW, and participating in various educational and mentoring programs for fellow inmates. Despite these efforts, Smart's time in prison has been challenging. In October 1996, she was severely beaten by 2 fellow inmates who accused her of being a snitch. The attack left her with a fractured nose and a broken eye socket, requiring the insertion of a plastic plate in her face. The 2 inmates were convicted of second-degree assault and transferred to different facilities. This incident left Smart dealing with chronic pain and mental health issues, including thoughts of suicide. Smart has made several attempts to have her sentence reduced or to obtain a pardon, but all have been denied. She has filed multiple appeals, arguing that her trial was unfair and that she was wrongfully convicted. In 2005, the New Hampshire Executive Council unanimously denied her pardon request. Her last federal appeal was rejected in 2002, and in 2023 she lost her final appeal, cementing her life sentence without the possibility of parole. In recent years, Smart has continued to seek ways to reduce her sentence. On June 11, 2024, she released a videotaped statement in which she accepted responsibility for her husband's slaying for the first time. She expressed deep remorse and reflected on her past actions, acknowledging her role in the crime and the manipulation of Billy Flynn. This statement was part of an effort to seek clemency or a reduced sentence from the New Hampshire authorities. Throughout her incarceration, Smart has remained a controversial figure. While some view her as a manipulative mastermind who got what she deserved, others see her as a victim of her circumstances and a flawed judicial process. Her case continues to be a topic of interest and debate, inspiring books, movies, and documentaries that explore the complexities and nuances of the events surrounding the tragic passing of Greg Smart. On a quiet morning in Massapequa, New York, on May 19, 1992, an event occurred that would forever change the lives of 3 individuals. The protagonist of this story is Amy Fisher, a 17-year-old high school student. She wasn't just any teenager. She was involved in a secret, scandalous relationship with a man twice her age, Joey Buttafuoco. Amy Fisher was a high school student, just 16 years old, when she first met Joey Buttafuoco. Their paths crossed when Amy brought her car to Joey's auto body shop for repairs. Joey Buttafuoco was then a 36-year-old auto body shop owner. He was married to Mary Jo Buttafuoco, a devoted wife and mother. Joey and Mary Jo had built a life together, raising their children in what seemed to be a peaceful suburban setting. However, beneath this veneer of normalcy lay a tumultuous and illicit affair between Joey and Amy, which would later erupt into the infamous Long Island scandal in 1992. Joey Buttafuoco, a charismatic and somewhat brash man, quickly developed a rapport with the young Amy. Despite the significant age difference, their relationship soon turned from professional to personal. Joey's charm and attention captivated Amy, who was navigating the tumultuous waters of teenage emotions and infatuation. Their relationship became sexual, although Joey initially denied this aspect vehemently to both the public and his wife. As their affair progressed, Amy became increasingly infatuated with Joey. She viewed him not just as a lover, but as a possible life partner. Joey, on the other hand, appeared to enjoy the attention and excitement that came with the affair. He showered Amy with gifts and affection, further deepening her emotional attachment to him. Joey's promises and reassurances led Amy to believe that he would eventually leave his wife, Mary Jo, for her. Amy Fisher's obsession with Joey intensified over time. She began to see Mary Jo Buttafuoco as the sole obstacle preventing her from being with Joey. This belief was compounded by Joey's continued involvement with Amy, even as he maintained his marriage to Mary Jo. The affair was not just a secret, it was a driving force in Amy's life, influencing her decisions and actions in profound ways. Joey Buttafuoco's denials of the affair added to the complexity of the situation. To the public, he presented himself as a victim of Amy's infatuation and a devoted husband wrongfully accused. Behind the scenes, however, he maintained his relationship with Amy, further complicating the narrative. His dual life, one as a family man and the other as Amy's lover, set the stage for the tragic events that would soon unfold. As Amy's obsession grew, so did her determination to remove Mary Jo from the equation. She fantasized about a life with Joey, free from the constraints of secrecy and guilt. This fantasy, however, was built on a fragile foundation of lies, manipulation, and emotional turmoil. Amy's young age and impressionable nature made her particularly vulnerable to Joey's influence, blurring the lines between right and wrong in her mind. The relationship between Amy Fisher and Joey Buttafuoco was a volatile mix of passion, deception, and desperation. It was a relationship that defied societal norms and ultimately led to a series of events that would devastate the lives of everyone involved. As the affair continued, the stage was set for the dramatic and violent confrontation that would forever change their lives and capture the nation's attention. On May 19, 1992, the tension and obsession that had been building in Amy Fisher reached a tragic climax. Driven by a desperate desire to secure her place with Joey Buttafuoco, Amy decided to confront the perceived obstacles standing in her way: Joey's wife, Mary Jo Buttafuoco. On that fateful day, Amy drove to the Buttafuoco residence in Massapequa, New York. Armed with a .25 caliber handgun, she approached the house, her mind set on a confrontation that she believed would change her life forever. As she reached the front door, she rang the bell, and Mary Jo Buttafuoco answered. What followed was a brief but devastating encounter. Amy initially attempted to engage Mary Jo in conversation, showing her a T-shirt from Joey's auto body shop as a pretense for her visit. She claimed to have a car issue and mentioned that Joey had sent her over. This tactic was likely an attempt to disarm Mary Jo and create a moment of confusion. However, as the conversation progressed, Amy's true intentions became clear. Without warning, Amy pulled out the handgun and shot Mary Jo in the head at point-blank range. The bullet struck Mary Jo just below her right ear, lodging at the base of her brain. Despite the severity of her injuries, Mary Jo did not immediately lose consciousness. Instead, she managed to call for help, drawing the attention of neighbors who quickly came to her aid and summoned emergency services. The immediate aftermath of the shooting was marked by chaos and confusion. The tranquil neighborhood of Massapequa was suddenly thrust into a state of panic. As Mary Jo Buttafuoco lay bleeding on her front porch, neighbors who heard the gunshot rushed to her aid, calling 911 for emergency assistance. The rapid response of first responders was critical in ensuring that Mary Jo received the urgent medical care she needed to survive the life-threatening injury. Police and emergency medical personnel arrived swiftly, securing the scene and tending to Mary Jo's fatal injuries. She was rushed to the hospital in critical condition. The bullet caused significant damage, resulting in partial paralysis on one side of her face and deafness in one ear. The doctors decided that attempting to remove the bullet would be too risky, so it remained lodged in her neck. Her recovery would be long and arduous, but more on that later. Meanwhile, the detectives began canvassing the area for witnesses and gathering evidence. The urgency of the investigation was palpable. A violent crime had been committed in broad daylight, and the police were determined to apprehend the perpetrator swiftly. Joey Buttafuoco, upon being informed of the attack on his wife, hurried to the scene. His initial reaction was one of shock and disbelief. When questioned by the police, Joey provided the name of Amy Fisher, describing her as a frequent visitor to his auto body shop and one of his recent customers. Joey's prompt identification of Amy as a person of interest was a crucial lead for the investigators. Despite his cooperation in identifying Amy, Joey Buttafuoco was quick to deny any romantic involvement with her. He insisted that their relationship was strictly professional, with Amy visiting his shop for car repairs and nothing more. Joey's denials were emphatic, and he portrayed himself as a devoted husband who had no knowledge of Amy's intentions or the violent acts she had committed. As the police investigation intensified, they began to piece together a more comprehensive picture of the events leading up to the shooting. They discovered that Amy Fisher had not only been romantically involved with Joey, but had also become increasingly obsessed with him. This obsession culminated in her decision to eliminate Mary Jo, whom she saw as the primary obstacle to her relationship with Joey. Immediately after, the police zeroed in on Amy Fisher as the prime suspect. Based on Joey Buttafuoco's information and the rapidly gathered evidence, authorities moved quickly to locate and apprehend Amy. The arrest took place without incident. Amy Fisher was taken into custody, and the formal charges were soon laid out: attempted slaying. This charge reflected the premeditated nature of the crime, as Amy had driven to the Buttafuoco residence with a clear intention to confront and harm Mary Jo. Upon her arrest, Amy Fisher was subjected to a thorough interrogation. The detectives aimed to unravel the details of her relationship with Joey Buttafuoco and her motivations for the attack. During these interrogations, Amy maintained that Joey had influenced her actions, claiming that he had manipulated her emotions and encouraged her to view Mary Jo as an obstacle to their future together. This narrative positioned Amy as a manipulated teenager, caught in the web of an older man's deceit. As the investigation proceeded, the evidence against Amy mounted. Eyewitness accounts, forensic evidence, and Amy's own statements painted a damning picture. The police discovered letters and notes between Amy and Joey, revealing the depth of their involvement and Amy's escalating obsession. Additionally, physical evidence, such as the handgun used in the shooting and the t-shirt Joey had given Amy, corroborated the story that she had been at the Buttafuoco home with violent intent. Amy's trial began in September 1992. During the proceedings, the prosecution portrayed her as a Long Island Lolita, a term coined by the media to describe her as a young seductress led astray by an older man. The defense countered by depicting Amy as a misguided teenager who had been emotionally manipulated by Joey. Faced with overwhelming evidence, Amy ultimately decided to plead guilty to first-degree assault as part of a plea bargain. In December 1992, she was sentenced to 5 to 15 years in prison, with the possibility of parole after serving 5 years. Amy served 7 years in total before being released on parole in 1999. Joey Buttafuoco's legal battles were equally dramatic. Initially, Joey denied any sexual relationship with Amy and any involvement in the planning of the attack. However, as the investigation continued, evidence began to surface that contradicted his claims. Witnesses and physical evidence suggested that Joey had indeed been involved with Amy in a more than professional capacity. In October 1993, Joey Buttafuoco was charged with statutory assault after admitting to having a sexual relationship with Amy Fisher when she was 16 years old, below the age of consent in New York. Joey pleaded guilty to the charge and was sentenced to 6 months in jail, of which he served 4 months before being released on good behavior. Throughout the legal proceedings, the media played a significant role in shaping public perception of the case. The dramatic elements of the story, a teenage girl involved in a passionate affair with a married man, a violent attack on an unsuspecting wife, and the subsequent legal battles, provided a wealth of material for media exploitation. Regarding Mary Jo Buttafuoco, after the traumatic shooting incident, she faced a long and painful recovery process. The bullet lodged in her neck caused partial paralysis on one side of her face and left her deaf in one ear. Despite the physical and emotional scars, Mary Jo exhibited remarkable resilience. She underwent numerous surgeries, including a significant one in 2017, to repair her partially paralyzed face, which allowed her to smile fully for the first time in 25 years. Mary Jo's journey to recovery wasn't just about physical healing. She also had to grapple with the emotional aftermath of the attack and her husband's infidelity. For many years, she stood by Joey, defending him publicly and trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy for their children. However, in 2003, she decided to divorce Joey, a decision that marked a turning point in her life. In 2009, Mary Jo published a memoir titled "Getting It Through My Thick Skull: Why I Stayed, What I Learned, and What Millions of People Involved with Sociopaths Need to Know." The book provided an in-depth look at her experiences and offered insights into the psychological manipulation she endured. Mary Jo's story of survival and empowerment resonated with many, and she has since become an advocate for victims of violence and those dealing with facial paralysis. Amy Fisher was released on parole in 1999 after serving 7 years in prison. Initially, she attempted to lead a more conventional life, marrying Louis Ballera in 2003 and having 3 children. She also wrote another memoir, If I Knew Then, which detailed her side of the story and her life after the scandal. However, Amy's notoriety followed her, and she struggled to escape the shadow of her past. In 2007, a sex tape she had made with her husband was leaked, leading to a career in the adult entertainment industry. Amy starred in several adult films and made appearances in strip clubs, a decision that sparked further media attention and controversy. Despite these ventures, Amy expressed regrets about her past actions and attempted to rebuild her life multiple times. Amy and Louis Ballera eventually divorced in 2015. She continued to make sporadic appearances in the media and remained a figure of public interest, particularly for those who remembered the original scandal. As of 2024, Amy Fisher is still active as a webcam model. Joey Buttafuoco's life after the scandal was marked by continued legal issues and attempts to capitalize on his notoriety. After serving his sentence for statutory assault, Joey and Mary Jo moved to California. However, his legal troubles didn't end there. In 1995, he was arrested for soliciting a prostitute, which violated his probation and resulted in additional jail time. Joey's criminal activities extended into the 2000s. In 2004, he pleaded guilty to auto insurance fraud, receiving a 1-year jail sentence and a lifetime ban from the auto body industry in California. His legal problems persisted with another arrest in 2005 for possession of ammunition. Despite these issues, Joey attempted to leverage his infamy into a Hollywood career. He made appearances in various TV shows and movies, including a stint on Celebrity Boxing, where he fought against Amy Fisher's husband, Louis Ballera. In 2005, Joey remarried Ivanka Franco, but his life remained turbulent due to his criminal record and public image. The Amy Fisher and Joey Buttafuoco scandal, marked by betrayal, deceit, and violence, captivated the public's imagination and remains one of the most infamous true crime stories in American history. The case serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of manipulation and the far-reaching impacts of violent actions. It also underscores the resilience of those who, like Mary Jo Buttafuoco, managed to rebuild their lives despite overwhelming adversity. That being said, if you found this story compelling, let us know your thoughts in the comments below. Do you believe that Amy Fisher, a teenager and underage at the time, was truly manipulated by Joey Buttafuoco? Or was she acting on her own accord? Was Joey's sentencing justified given the severity of his actions and their impact on Amy's life? And finally, be sure to share a few words about the bravery and resilience of Mary Jo Buttafuoco in her remarkable journey of recovery. We'd love to hear your perspectives on this case. Also, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more deep dives into true crime cases that shock the world. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an update.